The war had lasted 400 years. Nobody remembered why it started. The species of the galactic communion had been killing each other for so long that the killing itself had become the reason. Worlds burned, fleets shattered, entire generations were born into fire and died in silence, floating through the cold black between stars. Delegate Pulo had seen enough of it. He was old now, older than most of his kind ever lived to be, and his forearms ached with a tiredness that sleep could not fix. He stood at the observation window of the space station called the Accord, watching ships dock one by one. Each ship carried a delegation from a different species. Each species hated at least 3 others in the room. Pulo's job was to make them sit in the same hall and talk instead of shoot. He did not feel hopeful. The Accord was the largest diplomatic station ever built. It floated in neutral space, far from any claimed territory, a massive ring of metal and glass spinning slowly against the stars. Pulo had spent 2 years preparing it. Every detail mattered. The air was filtered to suit 40 different species. The gravity was set to the galactic average. The food was carefully prepared so that no delegation would be poisoned by another species' lunch. It was exhausting work, and Pulo did it because someone had to. The guest list was long. Over 60 species had been invited. Most of them mattered. A few were included out of politeness. And one, a newly discovered species from an unremarkable yellow star at the edge of the spiral arm, was included, because the Communion's bylaws required that all spacefaring civilizations receive an invitation. Nobody even remembered adding them to the list. They were called humans. Pulo was reviewing seating arrangements when his assistant rushed in, all 6 eyes wide with alarm. "Delegate, the humans have arrived. You should come to the docking bay." Pulo clicked his mandibles in annoyance. He had 40 delegations to manage, 2 of which had already threatened to leave, and now he had to greet a species that most of the galaxy had never heard of. He followed his assistant anyway, because protocol demanded it. The docking bay was immense, designed to hold the elegant cruisers and ceremonial barges of the galaxy's great civilizations. When Pulo arrived, he found a crowd already gathered. Dozens of alien delegates and their staff stood at the viewing gallery, staring down at the bay in silence. That was unusual. Arrivals were normally ignored. Pulo pushed his way to the front and looked down. The human ship sat in the bay like a scar. It was not beautiful. It was not decorated with the colors of its nation, or carved with symbols of peace. It was a block of dark metal, thick and dense, covered in marks that Pulo recognized immediately. Battle damage, scorch marks from energy weapons, dents from kinetic impacts, patches of welded repair that showed different shades of metal, each one a wound that had been closed but not hidden. The ship was small by galactic standards, but it felt heavy. It sat on the docking platform, and the platform groaned under its weight. Pulo checked the data on his tablet. The ship's hull density was nearly 3 times the galactic standard. It was built like a creature that expected to be hit and planned to survive it. A ramp lowered from the ship's belly. 5 figures walked out. The one in front was a male of average height for his species, which meant he was shorter than most of the aliens watching. He wore a dark uniform with simple markings on the shoulders. His hair was black and cut short. His face was calm. He looked around the docking bay with steady dark eyes that moved slowly, taking in everything, and then he smiled. Pulo felt his thorax tighten. There was something about the smile. It showed teeth. The male walked forward and stopped in front of Pulo. He pressed his hands together and bowed slightly. "Admiral Tejo, United Earth Delegation," he said. His voice was quiet and warm. "Thank you for the invitation, Delegate. We are honored to be here." Then he extended his right hand, open, palm facing up. On Pulo's world, an open hand was a threat display. It meant, "Look at my weapon hand." It meant, I could strike you. Pulo's legs locked, his vision blurred. For 3 horrible seconds, he was certain the human was about to attack him. But the human just stood there, hand out, still smiling. One of his companions, a female with a round face and bright eyes, leaned forward and whispered something. The Admiral lowered his hand and bowed again. My apologies. On our world, that gesture means friendship. We have much to learn about each other. Pulo managed to nod. His hearts were still beating too fast. The rest of the delegation introduced themselves. There was a tall female called Yuna, who stood behind the Admiral like a shadow, her eyes never stopping their movement across the room. There was a cheerful male called Jiwan, who carried a bag full of information packets and handed them to anyone who came near. There was a quiet female called Sumi, who wore a small device in her ear and seemed to be listening to several conversations at once. And there was a very large male called Dowan, who stood at the back of the group and said nothing at all. Dowan was the one Pulo could not stop looking at. The male was enormous. His shoulders were wider than the doorframe. His arms were thick with ropes of something that moved under his skin when he shifted his weight. Muscle, Pulo realized. The human was made of muscle and bone, and wrapped in skin that showed every movement underneath. He looked like something that had been designed by a world that was trying to kill everything on it. Later that night, Pulo sat in his quarters and opened one of Jihuan's information packets. It contained a brief history of Earth. He read about the ice ages and the volcanoes. He read about the predators and the plagues. He read about the wars. He read for a long time. When he was finished, he sat very still in the dark and wondered what kind of world could produce creatures like that, and what kind of creatures could survive a world like that and still arrive at a peace summit with a smile. He did not sleep that night. 3 decks below, Sergeant Dowan set his alarm for 5 in the morning. He planned to go for a jog before breakfast. He liked to stay in shape. The first morning on the Accord began with a security alert. 3 separate delegations filed formal complaints about a large creature running through the station's corridors at high speed before dawn. Station security reviewed the camera footage and found Sergeant Dowan jogging at a steady pace, wearing short pants and a sleeveless shirt, his breath forming small clouds in the corridor's cool air. He was not running from anything. He was not running toward anything. He was simply running, and when he reached the end of the corridor, he turned around and ran back. Advisor Mako, the Communion's military analyst, watched the footage 17 times. He was a reptilian male with cold yellow eyes and a mind built for calculating threats. He noted that the human maintained his pace for over 1 hour without stopping. He noted that the human's body temperature rose, but did not become dangerous. He noted that the human was sweating, and that this sweating appeared to be a cooling system built into the skin itself. Mako added this to his file on humanity. The file was growing thicker by the hour. The opening ceremony of the summit took place in the Great Hall, a vast circular room with a domed ceiling that displayed the stars outside. Each delegation sat at a curved table arranged in rings, with the most important species near the center, and the lesser-known ones at the edges. The humans were placed at the outermost ring, between a delegation of fungal beings who communicated through spores, and a group of crystalline entities who did not communicate at all. Admiral Tejo did not complain about the seating. He sat down, folded his hands, and listened. The opening dinner was held that evening. It was supposed to be a simple social event, a chance for delegations to meet in a relaxed setting before the serious negotiations began. Long tables were arranged across a wide hall, and food from dozens of worlds was laid out in careful sections. The humans ate from their own supplies, which they had brought in sealed containers. Dr. Jihuan explained to anyone who asked that human food contained substances that were toxic to most other species. He said this with a bright smile, as if it were a fun fact and not deeply alarming. Lieutenant Sumi sat next to a group of delegates from 3 different species. They were making polite conversation about their homeworlds. One of them, a tall and thin being with pale blue skin, asked Sumi about Earth's climate. Sumi thought for a moment. "It depends on where you are," she said. "Near the middle of the planet, it can reach 50 degrees. More the top and bottom, it drops to -60. We have storms that spin across entire oceans and flatten cities. We have waves of shaking ground that split the land open. We have mountains that explode and cover the sky with ash for months." She paused and took a sip of water. "But mostly, it is nice. I am from a coastal city. The summers are lovely." The blue-skinned delegate set down his eating utensil. He had stopped chewing. "You live on a death world," he said quietly. Sumi tilted her head. "I have heard other species call it that. We just call it home." At another table, Captain Yuna was speaking with Advisor Mako. He had approached her deliberately, hoping to gather information through casual conversation. He asked about the gravity on Earth. Yuna told him. The number meant nothing to her. It was simply the ground she had grown up on, the weight she had always carried in her bones. Mako converted the number in his head and felt his tail go rigid. Earth's gravity was 3 times the galactic average. That meant every human on this station was carrying 3 times more skeletal and muscular strength than they needed. Every step they took here was effortless. Every movement they made was restrained. They were holding back without even knowing it. He looked at Yuna's legs, at the way she stood with easy balance, and he understood why Dawan could run for an hour without stopping, and why the human ship was built like a fortress. They came from a world that crushed them every day of their lives, and they had grown strong enough to push back. "Your world made you into soldiers," Mako said. Yuna shook her head. "Our world made us into survivors. We chose the rest ourselves." Mako did not know what to say to that. The evening took a dangerous turn when 2 rival delegations met in a corridor outside the dining hall. They were the Fen and the Gorath, 2 species that had been at war for over a century. Words were exchanged. Threats followed. One of the Gorath delegates raised a ceremonial blade. The Fen delegates spread their fins in a display of aggression. Station security was 3 corridors away. Sergeant Dowan was 10 steps away. He did not draw a weapon. He did not shout. He simply walked forward and stood between the 2 groups. He filled the corridor the way water fills a glass, completely and without effort. He looked down at the Gorath with the blade, and then looked down at the Fen with their fins spread wide. He did not speak. He did not need to. Both groups stepped back. The Gorath lowered the blade. The Fen folded their fins. They stared at Dowan the way small animals stare at something large that has wandered into their territory, with the sudden and total understanding that the situation had changed. Dowan nodded politely and walked away. Behind him, the 2 delegations stood in silence for a long time before going in opposite directions. High Speaker Lanai saw all of this. She was the leader of the Communion Council, an avian being with sharp golden eyes and feathers that shifted color with her mood. She was famous for reading body language better than any being alive. She had been watching the humans since they arrived, studying them the way a scientist studies a new element. What she saw disturbed her. The humans were relaxed. In a station filled with 60 species that hated each other, surrounded by beings that were larger, stranger, and openly hostile, the 5 humans moved through the corridors as if they were walking through a garden. Their heart rates were steady. Their pupils were calm. Their muscles were loose. They were not pretending to be brave. They were not performing confidence. They simply were not afraid. Lanai had seen many dangerous beings in her long career. She had met warlords and assassins and predators that could kill with a glance. All of them were alert, coiled, ready. The humans were none of these things. They were at ease, and that made them the most unsettling beings Lanai had ever encountered. Because a creature that is not afraid in a room full of predators is either too foolish to understand the danger or too dangerous to care. And the humans did not seem foolish at all. The bomb went off at midday when the Great Hall was full. It was planted in the eastern wing, inside a maintenance shaft that ran behind the walls of the main corridor. The blast tore through 3 decks, ripped open a section of the outer hull, and triggered emergency seals across half the station. The lights died, the gravity flickered. The sound of the explosion rolled through the accord, like thunder trapped inside a bell. And for a terrible moment, everything was dark and shaking and filled with dust. Then the screaming started. 60 delegations panicked at once. Some ran for their ships, some sealed themselves inside their quarters. Some simply froze, standing in the dark with wide eyes and trembling limbs, waiting for the next explosion that they were certain would come. Station security scrambled to respond, but their communication systems were damaged, and their officers were scattered across 20 decks. Delegate Puolo was thrown to the floor by the blast, and lay there, coughing dust, his 4 arms wrapped around his head. The humans did not panic. Captain Yuno was on her feet before the shaking stopped. She had been thrown against a wall by the blast, and a thin line of red ran down the side of her face, where the skin had split open. She wiped it with the back of her hand, looked at the blood, and ignored it. She pressed a device on her wrist and spoke 3 words. "Guard up, medical bay." Within 90 seconds, the 4 members of the Human Honor Guard had formed a defensive line around the station's medical bay. They moved through the dark corridors with a speed and coordination that made it look rehearsed, but it was not. It was trained. Every human soldier learned to operate in darkness, in chaos, in the absence of orders. They did not need to be told what to do. They already knew. Sergeant Dowen found 2 alien delegates trapped under fallen ceiling panels in a corridor near the blast zone. One was a Fen diplomat, small and light, with a broken fin. The other was a Gorath official, heavy and wide, with a deep cut across his chest. The 2 species had been at war for a century. Dowen did not care about that. He lifted the ceiling panel with both hands, threw it aside as if it weighed nothing, and picked up both aliens, one under each arm. The Fen hung limply from his left side. The Gorath stared up at Dowen's face with an expression that was equal parts pain and absolute disbelief. Dowen carried them to the medical bay. He set them down gently and told Dr. Jiwan which injuries he had seen. Then he turned around and went back into the smoke to look for more. Admiral Tejo walked to the command center. He walked through corridors that were filled with smoke and floating debris, stepping over broken panels and sparking wires, and his face showed nothing but calm focus. He arrived at the command center and found it half empty. The station's command staff were either injured or trying to reach their posts through blocked passages. Tejo sat down at an open console. "Who is in charge here?" he asked. A young officer of Pulo's species looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "The commander is trapped on Deck 7. Communications are down. We cannot reach anyone." "May I help?" Tejo asked. He did not demand, he did not take over. He sat in a foreign station, in the middle of a crisis that was not his, and he asked for permission. The young officer nodded quickly, too scared to think of a reason to say no. His fingers moved across the console with the ease of someone who had done this many times before, in situations much worse than this. He rerouted power to the emergency systems. He opened backup communication channels. He pulled up a map of the station and identified the areas of greatest damage. He did all of this in under 4 minutes. Lieutenant Sumi appeared at his side. She had found the station's communication grid and patched into it using her own equipment. Without being asked, without authorization, She began broadcasting a calm and clear message in 12 different languages, directing delegates to safe zones and providing locations of medical stations. Her voice filled the corridors of the Accord, steady and warm, cutting through the noise and the fear like a light in dark water. In the medical bay, Dr. Ji-hwan was treating wounded aliens. He had opened a field medical kit that he carried in his bag at all times. When a station medic asked him why a linguist carried surgical tools, Ji-hwan looked up from the wound he was closing and said, "On Earth, everyone learns basic first aid. We have a saying, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. We are very good at preparing for the worst." He said it with that same bright smile, and the station medic felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damaged heating system. The saboteurs were found within the hour. There were 3 of them, members of a separatist faction that wanted the war to continue. They had planted the bomb and retreated to a maintenance section on Deck 4, planning to wait until the chaos allowed them to reach their ship. They did not reach their ship. Sergeant Dowen found them first. He had been moving through the damaged sections of the station, helping with rescue efforts, when he stopped in a corridor and raised his head. He breathed in through his nose, slowly and deeply. The aliens who were with him stared. Dowen turned his head to the left, then to the right, then started walking with purpose toward Deck 4. He tracked them by smell. On Earth, the human sense of smell was considered average at best. In the galaxy, where most species had either lost their chemical senses or never developed them, it was something close to supernatural. Dowen followed the scent of explosive residue through 3 decks, around corners, down ladders, until he found the 3 saboteurs hiding behind a sealed door. He did not break the door down, though he could have. He called station security and waited. When the security team arrived, they found Dowen leaning against the wall beside the sealed door, arms crossed, perfectly calm. "They are inside," he said. 3 of them. They smell like the bomb. The security team opened the door and arrested the saboteurs without incident. The 3 separatists did not resist. They had heard him stop outside their door. They had spent 12 minutes in the dark, listening to the sound of a human breathing on the other side of the wall, and by the time the door opened, the fight had already left them. The crisis was over in less than 2 hours. The dead were counted. The wounded were treated. The fires were put out. The hull was sealed. And when the Great Hall was cleared of debris, and the delegations were called back to the table, the 5 humans took their seats at the outermost ring. Their uniforms were dusty. Yuna still had dried blood on her face. Dowen's arms were streaked with soot from carrying bodies through wreckage. Admiral Tejo straightened his collar, looked at Delegate Pulo, and said, "Shall we continue?" 60 delegations stared at the humans in silence. The silence lasted a very long time. The emergency session of the Communion Council began 3 hours after the bombing. It was closed to all outside delegations. Only the senior members of the council were present. High Speaker Lanai, Delegate Pulo, Advisor Mako, and Archivist Tibi, the gelatinous being who served as the keeper of all galactic records. The room was small and sealed and lit by a single pale light. The topic was not the bombing. The topic was the humans. Mako spoke first. He stood at the center of the room and projected his findings onto the wall behind him. He had not slept since the humans arrived. His yellow eyes were dull with exhaustion, but his voice was sharp and clear. "I have completed my threat assessment of the species known as humans," he said. "I will present my findings in order of increasing concern." He began with biology. Humans were carbon-based, warm-blooded, laterally symmetrical. Nothing unusual there. But then the details began to stack on top of each other in a way that made the room go quiet. Humans were persistence predators. They did not have claws or venom or natural armor. They did not fly or swim at great speed or hide behind camouflage. What they did was walk. They walked after their prey, across open ground, under a burning sun, for hours and hours and hours, until the prey collapsed from heat and exhaustion. Then they ate it. Their bodies were cooling machines, designed to shed heat through their skin, while every other creature on their world overheated and fell. They were not the fastest or the strongest things on Earth. They were the last ones standing. Pulo shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mako continued. Human bones, when broken, healed stronger at the point of fracture. Their immune systems learned from every disease they survived, building defenses that lasted a lifetime. Their brains were pattern recognition engines of extraordinary power, capable of finding connections between events separated by years, capable of planning decades into the future, capable of cooperation on a scale that no other known species could match. They are not individually the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, Mako said, but they are, by a significant margin, the most adaptable. They survive everything. Cold, heat, radiation, disease, starvation, isolation. They survive things that would end most species, and then they build civilizations on the rubble. Archivist Tibby rippled with anxiety. Tibby had finished reading the Human Cultural Packet 2 days ago, and had not been the same since. The gelatinous being quivered and spoke in a voice like water running over stones. I have read their history, Tibby said. They fought 2 wars that covered their entire planet. Millions died. Entire cities were erased in single moments by weapons they built themselves. And after this, after they burned their own world and buried their own dead in numbers that I cannot process without distress, they did not collapse. They did not fragment into isolated groups. They rebuilt. They went to their moon. They went to their neighboring planets. They came here. Tibby paused, trembling. What kind of species survives self-destruction and then reaches for the stars? Mako answered. The kind that refuses to stop. He moved to his next point. The human ship in the docking bay, the one that had frightened every delegate who had seen it, was not a warship. It was classified in human records as a mid-range patrol vessel. It was the equivalent of a transport vehicle with some weapons attached. It was not even close to their best ship. Mako let that information sit in the room for 10 seconds before continuing. Humans domesticated wolves, he said. Wolves were one of the most effective pack predators on their world. Humans did not kill them. They did not cage them. They befriended them. Over generations they turned wolves into companions, into partners, into members of their families. They have a documented tendency to form emotional bonds with anything, animals, machines, abstract concepts, even hostile species. Their capacity for attachment is, as far as I can determine, unlimited. He turned off his projection and faced the council. Here is my conclusion, he said. His voice was flat and tired and completely without comfort. If the humans wanted to conquer us, they could. They have the biology, they have the psychology, they have the technology. Their patrol vessel alone is more heavily armored than most of our warships. Their soldiers can outrun, outlast, and outfight any equivalent force in the Communion. And during the bombing, 5 of them, 5 out of a species of billions, responded to a crisis on a foreign station with more speed, coordination, and effectiveness than our entire security force. He paused. The fact that they sent a peace delegation instead of a fleet is either the greatest deception in the history of the galaxy, or they genuinely want peace. And I will be honest with this council. I do not know which possibility frightens me more. The room was silent for a long time. High Speaker Lanai dismissed the session. She asked the others to leave. Then she sent a private message to Admiral Tejo, requesting a meeting. He agreed immediately. They met in a small observation room overlooking the stars. Lanai sat on one side of a simple table. Tejo sat on the other. There were no assistants, no guards, no recording devices. Just 2 beings from 2 very different worlds, sitting across from each other in the quiet dark. Lanai studied him with her golden eyes. She could read body language the way others read text. She looked at the way he sat, the way he breathed, the way his hands rested on the table. She saw no deception. She saw no hidden agenda. She saw tiredness and sadness and something else that she could not name. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "Your species is young. You have no stake in our war. You owe us nothing. You barely know we exist. Why did you come?" Tejo was quiet for a moment. He looked at the stars through the window, and Lanai saw his jaw tighten, just slightly, the way a being's body tightens when it is holding something heavy inside. "Because we heard there was a war," he said. "Many species hear about wars," Lanai replied. "They do not cross the galaxy to attend peace talks." Tejo nodded. "Most species have not done what we have done to ourselves." He looked at her. "High Speaker, my species nearly destroyed itself. Not once, many times. We burned our cities. We poisoned our air. We built weapons that could erase everything we had ever created. And then we pointed those weapons at each other and dared ourselves to press the button." His voice did not shake. It was steady and low, like a man describing a wound that had healed but still ached in cold weather. "We came because we know what war costs," he said. "Not the ships, or the territory, or the resources. The people. The children who grow up without parents. The parents who bury their children. The silence after the bombing stops, and you realize that the person beside you is gone, and you will never hear their voice again." He placed his hands flat on the table. They were scarred. Lanai could see faint white lines across his knuckles and fingers, old marks from old wounds. "We are not wise," he said. "We are not better than you. We are a people who burned our own world, and stood in the ashes, and decided that we would rather build than burn again. That is all we are. And when we heard that someone else was burning, we came, because no one should have to learn the lesson we learned. Not if we can help." Lanai, who had spent her entire career choosing words with the precision of a surgeon, found that she had no words at all. She sat across from this small, scarred creature, from a death world at the edge of the galaxy, and she understood, with a clarity that cut through every political instinct she possessed, that he was telling the truth. She nodded once. Tejo nodded back. They sat together in the quiet dark for a while longer, watching the stars, and neither of them spoke, because sometimes silence says more than any language in the galaxy. The final session of the Peace Summit began on the 7th day. The Great Hall had been repaired. The broken panels had been replaced. The scorch marks on the walls had been painted over. But everyone could still smell the smoke, faint and stubborn, clinging to the metal like a memory that refused to leave. The delegations took their seats, 60 species, arranged in rings, facing each other across curved tables that were supposed to represent equality, but really represented how far apart they all were. The innermost ring held the great powers, the species that controlled the most territory, commanded the largest fleets, and had killed the most of each other over 400 years. The outermost ring held the minor players, the newcomers, and the humans. High Speaker Lanai opened the session. She stood at the center of the hall, her feathers shifting to a formal shade of deep blue, and she spoke the traditional words of the communion. She called for reason. She called for the laying down of old hatred in favor of new understanding. Nobody listened. The Gorath delegation spoke first. They listed their grievances against the Fen, the stolen worlds, the broken treaties, the dead soldiers whose names filled books that no one on the other side would ever read. The Fen responded with their own list, longer and angrier and louder. Then the Valak delegation interrupted both of them to remind the hall that they had been fighting longer than either the Gorath or the Fen, and their suffering was therefore greater and more worthy of attention. Within 20 minutes, the hall was chaos. Species shouted over each other. Old alliances crumbled. New accusations were thrown like weapons. a delegate from the Orin Collective slammed his fist on the table and declared that his people would rather die fighting than accept peace with the Valak. A Fen ambassador rose from her seat and said that if the Gorath would not return the Vesa system, there was nothing to discuss. Pulo sat at his table and watched 400 years of war play out in words. His forearms hung at his sides. His eyes were dull. He had worked for 2 years to build this summit, and it was falling apart in front of him, and he could not stop it, because the hatred in this room was older and stronger than anything he could offer. Admiral Tejo sat at the outermost ring and watched. He watched the shouting and the posturing and the pain underneath it all. He watched beings who had lost worlds and children and futures stand up and scream because screaming was all they had left. He watched and he understood because he had seen this before, not here, on Earth, in the ruins of cities that his own species had burned. He leaned toward Captain Yuna. "I would like to address the assembly," he said quietly. "You know what will happen." "Yes. They may not listen." "I know, but someone has to try." Tejo stood. He raised his hand, the simple, open-palmed gesture that had nearly given Pulo a heart attack on the first day. This time, Pulo recognized it. The delegate caught Lanai's eye and nodded. Lanai raised her wing for silence. It took a full minute for the hall to quiet. When it did, 60 species turned their eyes to the outermost ring, where a small creature from an unimportant star system stood alone at his table. "The Assembly recognizes Admiral Tejo of the United Earth Delegation," Lanai said. Tejo walked to the center of the hall. He was not tall. He was not large. He was not impressive by any physical measure that the galaxy used. He stood in the middle of 60 species that were older than his civilization, more advanced than his technology, and more powerful than his single ship. And he looked like exactly what he was. A man standing in a room full of people who were hurting, trying to find the right words. He did not give a grand speech. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way he had spoken to Lanai in the dark observation room, quietly, steadily, like a man telling a story he had lived. "My species nearly destroyed itself," he said. "I know that many of you have learned this about us. I know our history frightens you. It should. It frightens us too." He paused. The hall was completely silent. 2 generations ago, my people fought a war that burned half our world. Not against aliens, not against monsters, against ourselves. We pointed our worst weapons at our own cities, at our own families, and we pressed the button. Millions died. The sky turned black. The water turned to poison. Children were born into a world that their parents had broken, and those children had every reason to give up. His voice did not waver. His hands were still at his sides, open and empty. They did not give up. They buried the dead. They cleaned the water. They planted trees in the ashes. And they decided, not because they were wise or brave or special, but because they were tired and sad and desperate, that they would rather build than burn. That was all. That was the great revelation of my species. Not some noble truth, not some ancient wisdom, just tired, broken people choosing to put down the weapons because they could not bear to pick them up again. He looked around the hall. He looked at the Gorath delegate with his ceremonial blade. He looked at the Fen ambassador with her list of stolen worlds. He looked at the Valak and the Orin and all the rest, and he saw on their faces the same exhaustion he had seen in old photographs of Earth. The hollow eyes of beings who had been at war so long they had forgotten what peace felt like. "I am not here to tell you that peace is easy," he said. "It is not. It is the hardest thing my species ever did. Harder than war. Harder than survival. Because peace means sitting across from the person who burned your home and saying, 'I will not burn yours.' It means choosing to lose something. Your anger, your pride, your need to be right. so that your children can gain something better. He took a breath. We are not wise. We are not your example. We are a people who burned our own world and stood in the ashes and chose to build again. And if we can make that choice, if a species as broken and stubborn and foolish as ours can make that choice, then so can you. I believe that, because the alternative is the fire, and I have seen the fire, and I promise you, it is not worth what it takes. He stopped. He stood in the center of the great hall, with nothing more to say, a small man from a small world, and he waited. Behind him, Captain Yuna stood from her seat. She walked to the center of the hall and stood beside him, her arms folded across her chest, not as a threat, as a promise. Lieutenant Sumi stood next, then Dr. Jiwan, then Sergeant Dawan, who rose like a mountain coming to life, and walked forward with steps that the entire hall could feel through the floor. 5 humans stood together in the center of the galaxy's great peace hall. They were dusty and tired and scarred, and they stood there with the quiet certainty of beings who had already survived the worst thing in the universe and were still standing. The silence that followed was the longest silence the Great Hall had ever known. Then the Fen ambassador spoke. She did not shout. She did not list grievances. She said very quietly that her people would be willing to discuss shared governance of the Vesa system. The Gorath delegate responded. He said his people would agree to a ceasefire in the border territories, effective immediately. The Valak offered to open humanitarian corridors. The Orin Collective withdrew their declaration. One by one, slowly and painfully, like bones setting after a break, the delegations began to speak. Not with anger, with exhaustion, with the raw and honest exhaustion of beings who had been at war for 400 years and were finally ready to stop. The accord was signed before the station's artificial sun completed its cycle. It was not perfect. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, held together by nothing more than the desperate hope that building was better than burning. As the UES Horizon undocked from the station and turned toward the distant yellow light of its home star, Delegate Pulo sent a private message to Admiral Tejo. You terrified us, the message read. From the moment you arrived, your ship, your bodies, your history, everything about you terrified us. The reply came quickly. We know. We are sorry about that. Pulo looked at the message for a long time. Then he typed his response and sent it before he could change his mind. Do not be sorry. The galaxy has spent 400 years being afraid of each other. Perhaps what we needed was something new to be afraid of. He paused, then added, or perhaps what we needed was to see that the most frightening species in the galaxy was also the one that chose to sit down and ask us to try. The horizon grew smaller in the observation window, shrinking to a point of light, then to nothing. The stars filled the space where it had been. Pulo stood at the window for a long time, watching the dark, and for the first time in his long and tired life, he thought that the dark looked less empty than it used to. Somewhere on the horizon, heading home through the black, Sergeant Dowen set his alarm for 5 in the morning. He planned to go for a jog before breakfast. He liked to stay in shape.